President Trump toughened his stance toward China this week when he threatened an increase in tariffs. But how do tariffs actually work, and who actually pays for them? It is time for Yahoo U. Joining us now, Brian Cheung, with this week's lesson.
All right, well, class is in session, and today we're going to talk about tariffs because it is in the news at the moment. So what are tariffs, and actually who ends up paying them? Well, to illustrate this, let's come up with a fake scenario here. So I have a company, it's called Cheung Shoes. I manufacture sneakers, and the Trump administration puts in a 10% tariff on goods imported from foreign countries. So that means that if I need to source my shoes, for example, with fabric from abroad, I will need to pay a 10% tax to import that to the United States, even though I am a U.S. company. So that raises the question, what do I do here? Well, I have a few options. The first is, if I sell a pair of sneakers at $100, I could keep it at that same price and absorb the cost of that 10% tariff myself and lose a little bit of the margin. Another option is I can go back to the foreign country and say, hey, I don't like these prices, let's try to negotiate a new deal. Another option is I could simply go to another supplier, so in another country, for example, or even domestically in the US, but those prices are likely higher because if they were cheaper, I would have just sourced from them in the first place. But the last option, which is ultimately what a lot of companies end up doing, is raising prices. So let's say, for example, Julie and Adam, you are purchasers of Brian's Cheung shoes, for example. So Julie, you bought a pair of sneakers before the tariffs went up. I charged you $100. Ultimately, unfortunately, Adam, you didn't buy in early enough. So after the tariffs went up, I had to increase the price of my shoes by 10% so that I could, so that I can maintain my profit margins. So unfortunately, you now have to pay $110. So this illustrates what we see in terms of price increases when there are tariffs. And keep in mind, I'm a US-based company, but I've needed to raise the prices to keep my margins in place. But how does this affect the larger economy? Well, it has to do something with the GDP equation. Again, GDP is the preferred measure for how the economy is evaluated in terms of economic growth. So there are a number of components to it. C is consumption of the economy. I is investment by businesses. G is government spending. And then there's also the NX bit, which is an abbreviation for net exports. So net exports is exports minus imports. So when you consider the fact that if there are higher tariffs, that would in theory mean that imports should be less because it's more expensive to import goods. In theory, that would mean that the NX bit gets higher, which means that the GDP equation gets higher. So you can actually boost economic growth by, in theory, lowering imports. But as I just illustrated with the price increases, that's not to say that's at the benefit for companies and also consumers in the United States. So it's a little bit more complicated than that, and hence why tariffs are such a politically difficult issue. So that, in short, is how tariffs work.
And that's, we had guests on earlier who were talking about the impact from the trade war to GDP wouldn't be so great. But as you just very easily pointed out, consumers still wind up paying, and then you get the WTF face that you saw in my photo.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's why we hear so much about, this being a politically important issue. Because, it's in fiscal policy's best interest to try to play around with the trade balance. Again, it's a trade surplus if you export more than you import, and it's a trade deficit if you import more than you export. So controlling that balance through mechanisms like taxation or tariffs could actually help and improve some of the top-line GDP numbers. But as I just kind of explained, that doesn't always explain the underlying components or mechanisms of how the economy is running.
Right, and as we know, these tariffs are expected to go up by 25% and expected to affect a much more broader swath of products like shoes, potentially, for example. By the way, President Trump is talking at the White House right now. He said he got a letter from President Xi of China and said the trade talks will begin at 5 p.m. today. We had gotten indications it would happen later today, that it would begin later today. Now we're getting more specifics on timing. So 5 p.m. today. He also is saying he will speak to President Xi directly on the phone, I believe.